From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to The Hub. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. On March the 25th, Russia said the first phase of what it calls a special military operation in Ukraine have been mostly completed. According to Russian senior military official Sergei Rozhkovsky, Moscow has almost annihilated Ukraine's air and naval forces, while Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Kyiv's resistance has dealt, quote-unquote, a powerful blow to Russia. Meanwhile, the U.S. and the EU have announced a major gas deal on Friday. A month and several talks on, there is still no sign of a ceasefire. As shelling and fighting continue, casualties and refugees are now topping the agenda. And the warfare is far beyond the battlefield, as the war of information goes on as well. The Russian Defense Ministry said that just over 1,000 Russian soldiers died in battle, while the Ukrainian said that the number is actually higher. What's the end game for Moscow? To help us navigate through the latest developments, we're joined at this hour by Zhou Bo, Senior Fellow of the Center for International Security and Strategy from Tsinghua University. Senior Colonel Zhou, welcome to The Hub. I want to begin by asking you about the latest on the battlefield. Russia said its objective have shifted, saying that, quote unquote, our forces will focus now on the primary objective, which is the full liberation of Donbas. Do you think Russia is scaling back from its more ambitious targets, such as, capturing Kyiv?
Well, such kind of remarks are most interesting in that they are somewhat contradictory to the announcement by President Putin in the beginning, before the so-called special operation, because he clearly talked about overthrowing the regime in Kiev. So now we found that the strategic purpose of Russia seemed to scale back into focus on Donbas. This is a sea change, because previously you have seen Russian troops attacking Ukraine from different directions, in the north, in the south, and in the east. But now it's become clearly focused in one region, Donbas, which is in the east. So what does that mean? Does that suggest that because of the heavy losses of Russian troops, therefore the ambition has to be scaled back? Or is it simply a kind of pretension just to buy the time and then before another, offensive attack? We don't know. We have to see.
Yeah, initially, many would speculate that Kiev would be, besieged by Russian troops. Putin himself said its goal is to, quote unquote, denazify the country. And at this point, what do you think is the end game for Moscow?
Well, right now, the Russian troops are still within artillery range of Kiev, but they simply cannot take Kiev. So I believe the losses are really heavy, because fighting on foreign territory, you have a lot of problems, such as adequate logistics supply, such as the morale of your soldiers, who definitely would not be higher than those local people who are just fighting for their own country. And the problem is the Russian troops seem to be, the Russian troops are certainly not overwhelming in terms of number, because on such ground warfare, you have to have an overwhelming number vis-a-vis your enemies. But the Ukrainian forces have nearly 200,000 troops, while Russia only deploy about 150,000 troops. Well, sometimes the figures varies, but this is what I have learned from the latest report in newspaper.
Right, Senior Colonel Zhou, U.S. President Joe Biden just attended a NATO summit, and more support for Ukraine was pledged by himself as well as many NATO leaders. What specific military support do you think can come from the U.S. and NATO? Well,
I definitely understand that he would just go there to show solidarity of the West, to show the great effort of NATO, but he still has been trying a balance. What is his balance? His balance is never send American soldiers to the soil of Ukraine, and never send NATO troops to the soil of Ukraine, because this might trigger a direct confrontation with a nuclear power, the largest nuclear country in the world. because so far he has actually made a lot of efforts with one clear purpose: to avoid direct confrontation. For example, he denied the request from Poland to transfer MiG-29, and he actually denied setting up a fly zone. And of all the weapons he has sent so far to Ukraine, they're all defensive in nature rather than offensive. So in this way, I believe he would go there to boost the morale, to show so-called solidarity, but still he would keep the bottom line, that is not have a direct confrontation with Russia.
Right, but on the other hand, Ukrainian President Zelensky accused Russia of having used phosphorus bombs on civilians. President Joe Biden announced that the alliance would respond to Russia if chemical weapons are used in Ukraine. Of course, so far, Brussels and Washington have stopped short of engaging with Russia in war. Do you think things could change?
Well, these are simply speculations because NATO talk about the possibility of Russia launching a nuclear attack, chemical attack, or biological attack. These could be the worries, but they could also be used as a pretext, to just smear on the reputation of Russia, because all these weapons are just weapons of mass destruction. If they use it, if Russia use it, as President Putin has threatened with this very thin well, it would be a heavy blow to the international image of Russia, because Russia itself actually has pledged no first use of nuclear weapons with China, because China and Russia's relationship are good. So Russia and China actually have this kind of a bilateral arrangement of no first use of nuclear weapon. But the truth is that normally, if a country is confident about his conventional force, which is overwhelming, he could just announce no first use. In 1982, Leonid Brezhnev actually announced no first use of nuclear weapon as a Soviet leader, because at that time, the Soviet leaders were very much confident about the superiority of the conventional force. And the NATO was very much hesitant, to announce such a kind of no first use policy. But in fact, I think that right now the world has a very interesting question, because the United States will very soon publish a nuclear posture review. But from what I read, they probably will still refrain from making a clear-cut no first use pledge. This is very much sad in that China's policy of no first use is not that very far from that of the United States, because according to Joe Biden, the sole use of nuclear weapon is for deterrence. So that means unless and until you are attacked, you would not use nuclear weapons. So why don't you just make an announcement of no first use? This is the most realistic option at this moment. This is a silver lining, among the dark clouds.
Sure. Senior Colonel Zhou, we know that President Vladimir Putin's chief spokesperson, Peskov, refused to rule out the use of nuclear weapons at this point, especially if Russia faces what he calls an existential threat. Do you think Russia is bluffing, or is that still a largely deterrence strategy, like you said?
Well, this is exactly what I said. If you are confident about the superiority of your conventional force, then you don't have to rely on nuclear weapons. Because right now, the Russian armed forces, compared to its heydays during the Cold War, is much more weak. But Russia is still the country with the largest nuclear arsenal. So it just relies on its nuclear arsenal. So President Putin's remarks about, the so-called consequences that other countries might suffer, or about his instruction to raise the combat readiness of his nuclear forces, actually a reflection of that. But maybe it is just a strategy, the strategy of escalating before de-escalating.
Senior Colonel Zhou, let's talk about the U.S. and NATO. Joe Biden, attending the summit at NATO, said that the transatlantic alliance has never been more united. Do you think the alliance is somehow consolidated because of Ukraine?
Yes, of course it is consolidated because according to French President Emmanuel Macron, actually NATO is brain dead. And this kind of Russians be it aggression or be it a special operation in Ukraine has certainly revived NATO. But still the question is, what is the use of NATO? Actually, Russia's action is very much a response to the five easternward expansion of NATO after dissolution of the Soviet Union. So it is very much NATO's expansion that actually has triggered Russia's military operation. Or in other words, NATO's policy has backfired. So right now, we can almost imagine what would happen in Europe. After this hot war, definitely there is a cold war, because countries, European countries definitely will have a huge investment in the defense, and Germany is a clear example, because Germany used to be reluctant about military spending, but now all of a sudden, within a month, it has spent 10 billion euros in defense. And this is an example. The only question is, would such kind of massive military investment strengthen the so-called European strategic autonomy, which so far is a French slogan, or it would strengthen NATO? But because these are just like two directions, if it goes down to strengthen Europe, maybe the transatlantic alliance will suffer. It will be weakened rather than strengthened. But maybe it's not a bad thing, because in this regard, the United States actually have more resources focused on Indo-Pacific, which is a primary challenge.
So Senior Colonel Zhou, you're saying that there's probably going to be a Cold War following the hot war in Ukraine, right? What could that Cold War look like?
Yes, and I personally believe there would be two Cold Wars. One is after this hot war in Europe, another is already in the Asia Pacific because of the Trump's great power competition. So great power competition actually has ushered in a Cold War. People nowadays do not talk about a Cold War because even the leaders do not want to talk about a new Cold War. But let me ask you a question. Biden's policy toward China is very much a follow-up of Trump's policy toward China. Basically, it is extreme competition, short of war. But if a competition is already extreme, isn't it a Cold War? What else can it be? Because it is only 1 or 2 steps away from a hot war. So definitely we have entered another new Cold War.
Yeah, I would think that many experts would agree that what Biden or Trump have done is tantamount to a Cold War when you think about what Washington has been doing to China. And then, like you said, the military budget is another thing topping the agenda of the NATO summit. So far, only 10 out of 30 NATO members met the guideline of spending 2% of their GDP on defense in 2021. And this year, with the crisis in Ukraine, do you foresee an increase in defense spending in NATO?
Absolutely, because of this war in Ukraine. Previously, no matter how the United States want NATO country to increase the defense spending, it is very difficult. Actually, the United States would shoulder about 70% of NATO's expenditure. So therefore, all the American presidents would want NATO countries to actually spend more on defense spending. But because of this new situation, definitely the European country will spend more on defense spending. Because in the Cold War, Britain actually could spend about 5 to 6% of GDP on national defense. Right now, because of the new situation, I have no doubt many countries will just increase the defense spending to meet this so-called standard of 2% GDP on defense.
Finally, let's talk about the Ukraine-Russia negotiations that have been ongoing for a month, or for 3 weeks rather. President Zelensky said he's willing to talk directly with Vladimir Putin on the question of Ukraine not joining NATO. Zelensky said he's also willing to talk about the status of the Donbas region as well as Crimea. When do you think we can expect negotiations to bring about a ceasefire?
Well, I think that more depends on how President Putin thinks. Because President Zelensky, of course, wants to have a talk, right? Because only through conversation he could just find possible compromises. But it's the strategic objectives of President Putin that really matter. Because it depends on what kind of a plan President Putin really wants. But right now, we as we talked in the beginning, I have seen a shift in the strategic priority from a kind of a full-blown all-out war to Russia's focus in Donbas region. So it's very much a question of how Russia would consider what it has achieved or what it can achieve in days to come.
All right, Senior Colonel Zhou Bo, thanks so much for coming on our show and for sharing your insights with us this evening. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
You've been watching The Hub. Stay tuned for my interview with former pilot Mark Weiss on the plane crash in China last Monday. Coming up after a short break. Welcome back. On Monday, a China Eastern Airlines Boeing 737-800 carrying 132 people crashed after plunging from over 6,000 meters near Wuzhou on the remote hills of Tang County in the Guangxi Zhuang Autonomous Region in South China. 1 hour after flight MU5735 left Kunming, the aircraft crashed with such force that much of it disintegrated on impact. Search teams have recovered a black box, but the second one containing flight data has not yet been found. To shed some insights into what may have happened in the final moments, I'm joined today in Washington, D.C. by Mark Weiss, president of Weiss Consulting Group and former pilot of American Airlines. He retired some 10 years ago. Mark, great to have you with us. We're still all pained and shocked by what happened this past Monday. Harrowing stories of the passengers and their families visiting the sites of debris. Based on the information publicized in the past 5 days, what do you think happened to this doomed flight?
Well, first, certainly my heart goes out to everybody. You know, aviation is in some ways a very small community, and we all feel the tragedy when this happens. Anything that I say or anybody else says right now, in truth, is absolute speculation. The reason you do investigations is to whittle away at the what could have been this, could it have been that, to come to a definitive probable cause of this was most likely the reason this accident happened. Because the reason you do the investigation is not just to find the cause, but you want to prevent this from happening again for the same or similar reasons. So getting this information, working together with the CAAC, the investigatory bodies here in the United States, the NTSB, the FBI, the FAA, Boeing, General Electric, who made the engines, putting all the experts together and collaborating, putting all their brain power together, their collective knowledge, is what we're trying to do so that we don't want other families to have to suffer through this.
So, like you said, which scenario is more likely at this point? I mean, we cannot rule out other possibilities at this point, but what do you think is the more likely scenario or more likely scenarios?
Well, there's a couple that come to mind, but again, this is absolute speculation. Aircraft don't fall out of the sky. They're, if you're cruising, this happened at what they call the top of descent, just as you were really transitioning to start your descent for a landing. What could have happened? We've seen situations in the past where somebody was in the cockpit, whether it was a disgruntled passenger, whether it was a disgruntled pilot that actually wanted to commit suicide. We've seen that a few times. That's a possibility. We don't know who was in the cockpit until the voice recorder, which has been recovered, is analyzed, and that information.
It could have been a pilot committing suicide, or a passenger, or even a crew. We don't know.
Absolutely. We don't know because we don't know who was in that cockpit at the time. Now, that airplane, interestingly, had a pilot, the captain, the pilot, and then there was a second officer who was doing some training. Another scenario could have been that they were changing on that airplane, and perhaps there was an autopilot on, or the 737 cockpit is not that spacious. Somebody could have knocked into somebody and perhaps knocking off the autopilot, pushing somebody forward onto a control column and forcing that plane down. Now, normally you try to recover from something like that, but from the trajectory, what you saw, the telemetry in that airplane went down like that. So is it a scenario that's possible? Yes, it is, but we don't know at this time. And then however that happened, if that was one of the pilots still trying to control that airplane, did they have the training necessary to get out of a dive like that without having the airplane break apart? Remember, that airplane hit the ground in 77 seconds. You had rising terrain, an airplane going down at 500 miles an hour. You don't have a whole lot of time to react. So all of these scenarios are true. It could have been that perhaps part of the aircraft came apart. The horizontal stabilizer on the back of the, which allows the aircraft to use the pitch axis. If that had been damaged, if that had come apart, if there was a mechanical problem with it, that could have forced the airplane into a position where perhaps you could not have recovered.
Well, Mark, allow me to ask you this, if I may. You know, based on the current information, do you think it's more likely to be mechanical failure than a misoperation, lack of training by either of the pilot or any of the pilot? Or is it more likely to be due to a misoperation by a pilot rather than a mechanical failure?
We don't know. You know, and in truth, I'm trying to put out scenarios. I've run through some of the scenarios the last couple of days in a 737 flight simulator myself. We've tried all of that, and even with my training, I wasn't able to pull out of it. One of the other pilots, who was an acrobatic pilot, was able to pull out of it. But it, you know, and I had very good training. It's speculation, and in all honesty, I don't really know. And you don't want to point fingers and be accusatory. But the takeaway from all of this is when you get an answer, if there is credible evidence that upset training and recovery training could have helped this situation, then that should be something that would be incorporated into new training scenarios, not just at China Eastern, but at all other carriers, so that situations like this don't happen again.
Mark, you operated a 737-800, which was the exact model of the doomed flight this past Monday that went down in South China. But this model is generally considered a pretty solid model with a strong safety record, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a magnificent airplane. There's over 4,000 of these flying around the world today. It's a well-built airplane. It's got a great reputation. Pilots like flying it. You know, this was the aircraft, the precursor to the MAX, the 737 MAX. That situation on that airplane was very different from the MAX is very different from the 737-800.
How so?
Well, the 737-800 does not have the MCAS system in it. That was the system in the tail that moved the horizontal stabilizer. And if it's okay, I have a model of an airplane. I'm just going to show you, if you can see this. The horizontal stabilizer is this portion back here. On the MAX airplane, when you were trying to move that, this keeps the airplane stabilized in the pitch axis. When you move that, it stabilizes the airplane and it moves quickly. What happened in the MAX airplane is when the pilots tried to stabilize the aircraft, this would move in the opposite direction. It would go on and off and on and off, and the pilots didn't know it was available, and what happened was it just started bringing the airplane down. like that. I know that this is the same situation, but the 737 does not have that equipment on board the aircraft. And again, the other two MAX aircraft, that happened right after takeoff. They didn't have enough altitude. So, you know, they're kind of like we say, apples and oranges. You know, Boeing aircraft, it could have been an Airbus. It could have been any model aircraft that this would have happened to. Getting the flight data recorder and the voice recorder and sharing that information with the other interested parties globally is going to help the whole aviation industry.
So far, only one black box is recovered. What can we expect from the other black box? And to piece them together, what information can we get? Can you remind our audience again?
Certainly, there's two. The flight data recorder, which takes into account in the 737-800, takes over 1,000 parameters from everything where every switch, every dial, every movement of the control column, every position, functioning systems on the airplane are recorded every second. So you know, really, it's the general health of the airplane is what you're looking at. You're going to find out whether or not that airplane had a problem. You're going to find out whether the horizontal stabilizer had a problem. You're going to find out if the oil was on or off, who was flying the airplane. And you coordinate that with the cockpit voice recorder, which is, there's a number of microphones in the cockpit, and that captures, and I apologize for my puppy in the background.
No worries, Mark. You know, how long do you think this investigation, this analysis of the black boxes can take? How long does it usually take?
It can take a year, and that's not uncommon. The thing is, information sharing. Remember, you're going to have people here. You know, the voice recording is all going to be in Chinese. If you share that with other people, you have to have people who are qualified, aviation, English, and qualified people to be able to help decipher that for the other people who don't speak Chinese or working on the investigation. Aviation is a community that's close-knit, and we all respect each other's abilities, and we make sure that it can stay that way.
Senior former pilot Mark Weiss, thanks so much for shedding light on this very important issue. Thank you for joining us at this hour, and that will do it for this edition of The Hub on CGTN. On behalf of our team, I want to send our deepest condolences to those who died from this plane crash, and our thoughts and prayers are certainly with their families. Thank you for watching this episode. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. I'll see you again next week.